In the early 2000s, a woman visiting the grounds of Camp Sumter, Georgia, was in the restroom washing her face when the door to the facilities began to slam repeatedly, without rhythm and with great anger. There was no one there, and there was no wind, but the door slammed at least 3 times and maybe as many as 5. Petrified, the lady ran out of the bathroom and to the park ranger who served as both security and guide at the former Civil War camp. The ranger looked at her and made a statement. "You've heard the ghost." Yes, she did, like hundreds, maybe thousands of other people who have visited the camp since it became a national park in 1971. By the way, Camp Sumter's better-known and more infamous name is Andersonville. That woman was our writer's mother, who had never believed in ghosts, until that day in Georgia. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine some of the horrors of the American Civil War. Many historians credit the British for establishing the first modern concentration camps during the Second Boer War in South Africa in the early 1900s. The British might have been the first to use that name, but everything about Andersonville and the other prisoner camps we're going to tell you about just screams concentration camp. No, neither the British nor American camps were like the extermination camps of the Nazis in World War II, but they were camps for large numbers of prisoners of war, concentrated in one small place. And while they were not like the extermination camps of World War II, they were in many ways very similar to the smaller concentration camps in Germany and elsewhere. The reason we say that is simple. In the 3 most infamous camps of the war, Camp Sumter, more commonly called Andersonville for the town which lay nearby, Camp Douglas in Chicago, and Elmira Prison in New York, conditions were so abysmal that thousands of prisoners in each one died of disease, malnutrition, exposure, and neglect. Most of the deaths that happened did not occur because of the actions of the jailers, but by their neglect. And like the world did in 1945-46 after the horrors of the German camps were publicized, parents, children, brothers, sisters, friends, and fellow citizens were outraged by what they saw in the papers, magazines, and books. For the U.S. Civil War was one of the very first conflicts ever recorded in photographs. Andersonville is the most well-known camp for 2 main reasons. First, more men died there than at other camps, though Elmira was a much more deadly place in terms of percentage of deaths. Second, Andersonville kept Union prisoners, and the Union won the war. After the war, almost everything about the Confederacy was villainized, and not many people had sympathy for the Rebs that had started the war in the first place over slavery. So the weekly magazines were full of accounts of the horrors of Andersonville, and then of the trial of its commander, Confederate Captain Henry Wirz, the only man tried and executed for war crimes during the Civil War. All of the camps suffered from the same problems: overcrowding, extremely bad sanitation and polluted water, little and/or rotten food, and neglect, especially by medical doctors. At Andersonville, a small stream ran through the camp. It was the main source of water and sometimes the only source of water for the camp's prisoners. The area around the stream became a small marsh, became fetid, a low-lying, stinking, disease-ridden mini-swamp. The thing about the stream, it was often used as a latrine as well. Not that there weren't other latrines, or sinks as they called them at the time. The problem with the sinks in all 3 camps is that those inside were usually just a cement or brick area with bad or no drainage. All of the sinks attracted vermin like roaches, mosquitoes, flies, and rats. The outside latrines were all located in poorly drained areas and were often nothing but open cesspools. Many survivors wrote of their experience at Andersonville after the war. Here is part of the account of Sergeant Samuel Corthell of Massachusetts. The camp was covered with vermin all over. You could not sit down anywhere. You might go and pick the lice all off of you, and sit down for half a moment, and get up and you would be covered with them. In between these 2 hills, it was very swampy, all black mud. And where the filth was emptied, it was all alive. There was a regular buzz there all the time, and it was covered with large white maggots. Battle wounds that hadn't healed, or cuts, sores, or abrasions, suffered from disgusting infections which often turned into gangrene or septicemia, internal infection. Worse still, the camp hospitals through most of the war were grossly understaffed and dirty, though attempts were made to enlarge and improve them towards the end of the war, especially in the Union prisons. Like much of the medical treatment during the war, infected limbs were often amputated, and if they didn't die from the shock of the amputation, for there was no anesthetic, many died later from the infections of the new wounds. Camp Sumter was a rectangular camp covering 16.4 acres, which was expanded to 26.5 acres in later 1864. The camp was meant to hold 10,000 men, and that was crowded. As the war's end approached, the Andersonville held about 32,000 men. Because of extremely poor record-keeping and careless disposal of bodies, an exact total of dead isn't known, but historians believe 13,000 men died at Andersonville, and it was open for just over a year. At the smaller Camp Elmira in New York, nearly 3,000 men died in the year it was open, over 240 men per thousand. And at Camp Douglas in Chicago, which was open for a much longer period and went through important improvements by the end of the war, the total was somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 men. Let's try to set the record straight. Famous Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was a military genius. His plans and battles are studied at West Point even today. To many in the South, Forrest was and is a hero, and his legacy is still a hot-button issue, especially in Tennessee, where his statue was only removed from the state capitol in 2021. Forrest was also one of the first and most important members of the Ku Klux Klan. And though he ended his association with them when Klan violence began to escalate throughout the South after the war, Forrest's attitude on black people was clear. Before the war, he was one of the richest slave traders in the country. As a matter of fact, he was a millionaire before millionaire was even a word, and went on to finance his own unit when he became disgusted at how unprofessional the unit he volunteered for as a private in 1861 was run. Forrest was known for many things: his audacity in attack, his willingness to challenge orders and superior officers, having killed 31 men in hand-to-hand combat during the war and had over 30 horses shot out from under him. In recruiting for his unit, Forrest wrote an ad in a Memphis newspaper: "Come on, boys, if you want a heap of fun and to kill some Yankees." On April 12, 1864, Forrest attacked Fort Pillow, a Union outpost on the Tennessee shore of the Mississippi River, about 40 miles north of Memphis. The Union had established control over most of the Mississippi in 1862, interrupting a vital supply route for the Confederacy. Throughout much of the rest of the war, occasional Confederate attacks on Union positions on the river attempted to dislodge them, at least for a time, but failed to free the river from Union control. One of these attempts was the assault on Fort Pillow, which held about 600 Union troops, some of them from two newly established colored artillery units made up of African American soldiers commanded by white officers, and a small cavalry unit of white soldiers. After President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in May 1863, freeing the slaves in the South, quotes are really important here, though it only declared that slaves in states currently in rebellion were free. It didn't free slaves still held in northern slave states like Delaware and Maryland. The Confederacy responded by declaring that all black men captured wearing a Union uniform would be tried and executed. The trial part rarely happened. When at least 200 soldiers, mostly black, attempted to surrender, the rebels went berserk, releasing their pent-up fury and racial hatred on the prisoners, shooting some and stabbing and bludgeoning others to death after they had surrendered or were pleading for their lives. Some Confederate soldiers attempted to get Forrest to order a halt to the bloodshed, but he refused, telling his men to shoot them down like dogs. People in the North called for vengeance, and Forrest and his men to be hung. People in the South said that the rebels were only defending themselves, and that stories of a massacre were Yankee lies. Here is what one Southern soldier said happened at Fort Pillow. "Our men were so exasperated by the Yankees' threats of no quarter that they gave but little. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared but little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood, human blood, stood about in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased. In the spirit of reconciliation that followed the war, no one was ever prosecuted for what happened at Fort Pillow." This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.